The sensor woke me at 0219 outpost time, and for the first 4 seconds I thought it was a fault in the array. I had been asleep for less than 2 hours. I am not a species that dreams heavily. Haven sleep is short and mostly dark, a kind of scheduled nothing between one day and the next. So when the alert chime pulled me up out of that nothing, I lay still for a moment in my bunk and listened to my own heartbeat before I trusted the sound was real. It was real. I pulled on my duty jacket and walked the short curved corridor to the monitoring deck of outpost Calder Reach, and I told myself the whole way there that it was going to be nothing. A micrometeor scatter. A thermal bloom off the gas giant we orbited. Something explainable. Something that would let me go back to bed with a story to tell at breakfast about the night the system panicked over dust. It was not dust. The reading on my console was a light curve. Not starlight. Not any of the background radiation we catalogued out of habit every night. It was coming from the surface of the world we had been assigned to watch for 11 years, a world with no atmosphere worth breathing, no registered population, and no reason to be doing anything at all. The world's name, in the Concord registry, was Site 9, Sector Vale. Everyone on the outpost called it by its older name, the name from before the quarantine, the name that showed up in the old paper logs nobody had bothered to update. We called it Verdance. Verdance had not made a sound in 31 years. I sat down at the console and pulled the raw feed forward, and my hands were not entirely steady, which annoyed me, because I am a careful person and careful people do not let their hands shake over light reading. The pattern on the surface was pulsing in the visible green band, clustered across what our old maps called the lowland basin, and it was not random. Random light does not repeat. Random light does not hold a rhythm for 6 minutes and then change key, the way a voice changes when it moves from one sentence to the next. I had spent 4 years training as a xenobiologist before the Concord assigned me to border monitoring instead, which is a polite way of saying I had trained to study living things and been given a post where nothing was supposed to be alive. Calder Reach existed for one purpose. Watch Verdance. Confirm nothing changes. File the report. Go to sleep. It was, by every account I had been given when I arrived, the quietest posting in the sector, assigned to junior officers who needed a slow first tour before something with real stakes. I looked at the light curve pulsing on my screen, patient and structured and utterly impossible, and I understood, somewhere below the part of my mind that was still doing the sensible thing and running diagnostics, that my slow first tour had just ended. I did the correct thing. I always do the correct thing. It is, if I am honest, both my best quality and the quality that has cost me the most. I logged the anomaly under standard protocol, flagged it non-urgent pending confirmation, and began a manual review rather than waking the director at 2 in the morning over what might still turn out to be an equipment fault. I ran the calibration sequence twice. Both times it came back clean. I checked the array against our sister sensor on the far side of the debris ring, 300,000 kilometers away, expecting a discrepancy that would tell me one unit was malfunctioning. Both arrays saw the same thing. By the time I had confirmed that Verdance dead lowland basin was blinking at us in a repeating 6-minute pattern from 2 independent sensors, it was 0311, and I had stopped telling myself it was dust. I want to be honest about what I felt in that hour, because everything that came after makes more sense if you understand where I started. I was not afraid, not the way people mean when they say a discovery frightened them. What I felt was smaller and more personal than fear. I felt caught. I felt like a student who had been told a question was settled, who had stopped asking it, and who had just been handed proof that the question had never actually gone away. It had simply been waiting for someone to look at it directly. Verdance was supposed to be finished. The colony was supposed to be gone. The file was supposed to be closed. The light on my screen did not care what the file said. I sent the confirmed anomaly report to Director Osk at 0314, flagged urgent, and I sat at my console watching the basin pulse green against black, 6 minutes on, 6 minutes of nothing, and over again, until the comm panel chimed and his voice came through, thick with sleep and already sharp with the particular irritation of a man who does not enjoy being right about how quiet his posting was supposed to be. "Adale," he said, "this had better not be a dust cloud." "It isn't," I said. I checked twice. There was a pause on the line, the sound of someone sitting up, reaching for a console of his own. And then a much longer pause, the kind of silence that tells you someone is looking at exactly what you are looking at and trying to decide how much of their sleep they are allowed to keep believing in. "Verdance doesn't do this," he said finally, quietly, as if saying it firmly enough might make it true again. "No," I agreed. "It didn't." Osk had run Calder Reach for 6 years, which by outpost standards made him something close to a fixture. He was Harvan like me, older, built low and broad the way our people run when they've spent decades in low-gravity postings, with a particular stillness that comes from a career spent watching instruments instead of people. He was not a man who enjoyed surprises. He arrived on the monitoring deck within 11 minutes of my call, still fastening his jacket, and he did not say good morning. He looked at the screen, and he looked at it for a long time. "Show me the history," he said. I pulled the full 31-year record, which took almost no time at all, because for 31 years there had been nothing to show. A flat line. A world scoured of its atmosphere in what the old reports called an ecological collapse event, its surface reduced, according to the Concord's official assessment, to sterile regolith incapable of supporting the colony that had once been settled there. The colony itself, according to the same assessment, had been evacuated before the collapse, relocated to Concord-approved worlds elsewhere, its population absorbed quietly into the wider human diaspora that lived, worked, and largely stayed out of everyone's notice across a scattering of small approved settlements. That was the story. I had read it during my onboarding, in the first week of my first posting, in a briefing packet that took perhaps 20 minutes to get through because there was so little in it. Verdance failed. The humans left. The world is dead. Watch it, in case anything about that changes. Something about that had just changed. Run me the spectral breakdown, Osk said, and I did, and neither of us liked what came back. The light wasn't thermal. It wasn't any kind of industrial signature, no drive exhaust, no reactor bloom, nothing that matched a ship or a facility or any hardware in our identification library. The closest match our system could offer, with a confidence rating low enough that it flagged itself as unreliable, was bioluminescence. Living light. The kind of glow certain deep water organisms produce back on worlds with actual oceans, or certain fungal colonies produce in the dark understory of actual forests. Verdance had no ocean anymore. Verdance had no forests. Verdance, according to the file, had no biosphere at all. "It's a fault," Osk said, but he said it the way you say something you want to be told is wrong. "It has to be a fault. There's nothing down there to make light like that." "Then something is making it anyway," I said, and I regretted how it sounded the moment it left my mouth, too plain, not nearly deferential enough for a junior officer talking to a director 6-year senior. But he didn't reprimand me. He just kept looking at the screen, at the basin pulsing its slow green rhythm into the dark, and something in his posture had changed, gone from irritated to genuinely uncertain, and I had never seen that particular shift in him before. "Pull every visual pass we have from the last month," he said. "Every satellite sweep. I want to know if this has been building or if it just started tonight." It had been building. That was the thing that unsettled me most once I found it, more than the light itself. Buried in 3 weeks of routine low-resolution surface sweeps that neither of us had ever bothered to review closely, because why would you review closely something that was supposed to be a dead rock? There were faint traces of the same spectral signature, far too dim to trigger any alert threshold, growing steadily brighter night after night. Whatever this was, it hadn't switched on all at once. It had been waking up slowly, for weeks, and we had been asleep at our post the entire time, filing routine reports over the top of it without ever looking closely enough to see. "Nobody's going to want to hear that we missed 3 weeks of this," Osk said, and for the first time that night I heard something in his voice that wasn't irritation or uncertainty. It was closer to dread, the particular dread of a career officer who understands that being the person who has to explain an oversight to Concord Central is worse, in every practical sense, than being the person who discovers the anomaly in the first place. "We are not filing a report that says we missed it," he said, after a moment, more to himself than to me. "We are filing a report that says we caught it as soon as it became significant, and that we are already investigating." "Which we are." He looked at me. "Aren't we?" I want to explain something about Calder Reach before I go further, because it matters for understanding why the two of us made the choices we made that morning. The outpost held a crew of 9, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's habits, small enough that the arrival of anything new, a supply shipment, a rotation transfer, even a bad meal in the galley, became the subject of conversation for days. We were not equipped for discovery. We were equipped for confirmation, for the slow, patient repetition of the same routine checks, month after month, on a boundary that had never, in the outpost's entire operational history, needed to do anything but exist. That kind of posting changes a person in ways that are hard to notice from the inside. I had arrived at Calder Reach 11 years earlier believing, the way young officers often believe things, that I would prove myself quickly and move on to something that mattered. Instead, I had spent over a decade learning the particular discipline of watching nothing happen and calling it diligence. I had grown very good at it. I had also, I understood now, standing over a console that finally had something worth watching, grown quietly hungry for exactly this, without ever admitting it to myself. Osk, I think, had made his peace with the opposite outcome. He had stopped expecting his career to contain a moment like this one, and some part of him, I could see it in the careful, deliberate way he was moving now, was afraid of what it would cost him to be wrong about that. It wasn't really a question, and I understood what he was actually asking. He wanted to send a probe down before he told anyone above him that Verdance was doing something it had no right to do. He wanted an answer in his pocket before he had to admit there was a question. I understood that instinct completely, because it was mine too. I had trained for years to study living things, and I had spent 11 years watching a world everyone told me had nothing left alive on it. Some part of me, the part that had chosen xenobiology in the first place, had been waiting a very long time for a reason to look at Verdance the way I had once wanted to look at everything. I can have a survey drone ready for atmospheric insertion within 4 hours, I said. Osk exhaled slowly, the sound of a man committing to a decision he already half regretted. Do it quietly, he said. I don't want a request for authorization sitting in the queue at Central while we are still confirming what we are even asking about. We confirm first. We escalate second. It was, I would come to understand much later, exactly the wrong order to do things in. It was also, I have never quite stopped believing, the only order either of us could have chosen, given who we were and what we had spent our careers being trained to value. Confirm before you commit. Never bring an uncertain question to people who have the power to answer it badly. We sent the drone down at 0730 into a lowland basin that the Concord sealed files insisted was empty, sterile, and finished. None of us on that outpost had the faintest idea what we were about to prove wrong. I had built and flown a dozen survey drones over my years at Calder Reach, always into empty orbit, always cataloguing debris fields or mapping gas giant weather patterns, tasks important enough to justify the outpost's existence but never urgent enough to keep me from sleeping soundly afterward. Preparing this one felt entirely different. I checked its systems 3 times instead of the usual one, not because I doubted the hardware, but because some part of me understood, even before we launched it, that whatever it found was going to matter in a way nothing I had done in 11 years had mattered. The drone's descent took 40 minutes, and I watched every second of it from the monitoring deck, because I did not trust myself to be anywhere else. Osk stood behind me with his arms folded, saying nothing, which for him was its own kind of tension. The atmosphere thickened as the drone fell, thin and strange, nothing close to breathable, registering trace gases that our old files insisted shouldn't be there at all in the concentrations we were reading. Not enough to support us. Enough, unmistakably, to support something. The drone's cameras came online at 11,000 meters, and for a while there was nothing to see but grey haze and the long dark curve of the basin below. Then the haze thinned, and Osk made a sound I had never heard him make before, something between a breath and a word that didn't finish forming. Verdance was green. Not everywhere. Not the way a healthy world is green from orbit, in broad continental sweeps. It was green in one enormous connected patch across the lowland basin and the ridgelines beyond it, a spreading, deliberate green, threaded through with paler lines that our imaging system, after several confused seconds of trying to categorize them as geological fault lines, finally settled on calling what they visually resembled root systems. Vast ones. Root systems on a scale that didn't correspond to any single organism in our biological library, branching and rebranching across hundreds of kilometers, glowing faintly along their length with the same slow bioluminescent pulse we'd first caught from orbit. That's not a fault, I said quietly. Director, that's not a mineral formation. That's tissue. It can't be, he said, but he wasn't disagreeing with me. He was disagreeing with the world, the way you argue with weather. The drone dropped lower, skimming the canopy, and the canopy was not a forest in any sense either of us recognized. It was closer to a single continuous structure, trunks and fronds rising from a shared root mass, spaced with a regularity that felt less like natural growth and more like architecture. There were clearings among the growth, wide and circular, and in several of them our cameras caught structures that made my chest go tight in a way no reading on a screen ever had before. Buildings. Low, rounded, half grown into the surrounding growth rather than built beside it, their walls threaded through with the same pale glowing lines as the root systems outside. Not ruins. Not the crumbling remains the Concord's file described, the one supposedly abandoned 31 years ago. These structures had light in their windows. "There are people down there," I said. Osk didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had gone very careful, the voice of a man doing arithmetic he badly did not want to be doing. The colony was evacuated. That's the official record. Every human on this world was relocated before the ecological collapse. Then who built that? I asked, nodding at the screen, at a structure with light moving behind its windows, unmistakably, deliberately alive. Neither of us had an answer, and that absence sat between us for a long time while the drone continued its low pass, recording a world that the sealed files of the Concord had declared, with total institutional confidence, incapable of supporting exactly what it was plainly supporting. The drone was 70 meters above the canopy when something changed. I saw it before I understood what I was seeing, a ripple moving through the tree line below, fast, coordinated, the pale glowing lines beneath the canopy brightening in a wave that tracked the drone's flight path precisely, far too precisely to be coincidence. Something down there had noticed us. Something down there was watching back. "Bring it up," Osk said sharply. "Now, Adale." I was already reaching for the controls when the feed distorted, a burst of interference sweeping across every channel at once, not violent, not an attack in any sense our threat classifications recognized, more like being spoken over by something enormously loud that hadn't intended to be rude about it. For 3 full seconds the drone's camera showed nothing but a pattern of pulsing light, structured, rhythmic, unmistakably a signal rather than noise, and then the feed cleared and the drone was climbing, its systems intact, nothing damaged, nothing hostile done to it at all. It came back to us 40 minutes later carrying something none of our protocols had a category for, a fine dusting of pale spores across its hull, and embedded in its onboard memory, overriding nothing, simply added alongside our own recorded footage, a short sequence of light. 6 minutes long. The same rhythm we had first caught from orbit that night, compressed now into something dense and layered, pulses within pulses, patterns folding into other patterns the way a sentence folds meaning into its structure. It wasn't noise. Whatever was down there hadn't attacked our drone. It had used our drone to send something back up to us, deliberately, the way you might use a stranger's outstretched hand to place something carefully into their palm. We didn't know what it meant, but we both understood, standing there on the monitoring deck with a green, glowing, populated, listening world turning slowly beneath us, that whatever the sealed file said, Verdance was not finished. It had never been finished. We had simply stopped watching closely enough to notice it was still becoming something. I did not sleep that day, and neither did Osk, and by the time the second shift technician, a quiet, precise woman named Tam Sinovek, came on duty and found the two of us still hunched over the same screen we'd been hunched over for 11 hours, she took one look at our faces and didn't bother asking whether it had been a slow night. Tam Sin was the closest thing I had to a friend on call to reach, in the particular way that isolated postings manufacture friendships out of proximity and long silences. She was older than me by a decade, methodical in a way I found genuinely restful to be around, and she had a habit, when she was thinking hard about something, of tracing the same short line back and forth across her console with one finger, over and over, until she'd worked the problem loose. She was doing that now, tracing the same line, staring at the spore residue analysis I'd run twice already. "This isn't fungal," she said finally. "Not purely. There's cellular structure in here that doesn't match any classification we have. Some of it reads almost neural." "Neural," Osk repeated flatly, like the word itself was an accusation. "I'm not saying it thinks," Tamsin said. "I'm saying whatever grew this has structures that carry and process information the way nervous tissue does. I've never seen it in a plant analog before. I've never seen it described anywhere." She looked up at both of us. Whatever's down there isn't just alive. It might be one thing. One enormous, connected thing, spread across that whole basin. I thought about the root systems threading for hundreds of kilometers under the canopy, all of it pulsing in the same rhythm, all of it lighting up in that single coordinated wave the instant our drone crossed too low. I thought about buildings grown into a living structure rather than built beside it, with light moving behind the windows. "And the people in the structures," I said quietly. "Are they part of it, or are they living in it?" Nobody answered that, because none of us had any way to know, and because some part of me suspected, even then, before I had any evidence to support the thought, that the honest answer might be that the question itself was built on an assumption that no longer applied. Perhaps there was no longer a clean line between the two. It was Tam Sin, an hour later, sorting through the outpost's old archive logs while the rest of us tried to draft a report that wouldn't get us all removed from duty, who found the recording that changed the shape of everything. Calder Reach had not always been a monitoring post for a dead world. Before the quarantine, before the sealed file, before the official story of ecological collapse and quiet evacuation, this outpost had been a joint research station, staffed by a mixed survey team, Harvan and human together, studying Verdance while its colony was still active and its status was still, in the language of the old logs, developing favorably. The station's full archive from that period had supposedly been transferred to Central, and the local copies purged during the transition to quarantine status. Supposedly. Tamsin found 11 minutes of footage that the purge had missed, buried in a maintenance partition nobody had thought to check in 3 decades, timestamped 6 days before the quarantine order came down. We watched it together in the small crew room, the 3 of us crowded around a single screen, and I will describe only what I remember, because the full recording became, later, a formally verified piece of evidence in proceedings I am not permitted to characterize in detail here. It showed a woman, human, standing in what was unmistakably one of the grown structures we'd just seen in our drone footage, 31 years younger and half-built at the time, its walls still mostly bare growth rather than finished habitation. She was speaking to someone off camera, calm, unhurried, the way people speak when they believe they still have time. "They're not colonizing it," she said. "That's the part nobody back home is going to want to hear. We are not building on Verdance. Verdance is building with us. It figured out inside of 6 months that we could feel what it was doing if it let us close enough, and it started letting us close on purpose. I don't know if that makes it a partner or a parent, but I know it isn't a resource, and if the assessment team comes through here calling it an asset, we are going to have a very bad time explaining what we've actually found." A voice off camera, male, asked something too quiet for the archive to have caught clearly. The woman's expression shifted, and for the first time in the recording she looked less like a scientist reporting a finding and more like a person who had realized, mid-sentence, that she was frightened. "Because if Central hears the word neural network attached to an entire biosphere," she said, "they are not going to see a discovery. They're going to see a variable they can't predict and can't control, wearing the shape of a planet. And you know what this Concord does with variables it can't control." The recording ended there, cut cleanly, not with static or damage but with the abrupt precision of something deliberately stopped. 6 days later, the quarantine order came down. Total contact severance. Official designation, ecological collapse. Evacuation of all personnel confirmed and logged. Nobody in that recording had sounded like someone preparing to evacuate. Tamsin was quiet for a long moment after the footage ended, longer than I expected, and when I looked over at her I saw that her finger had stopped tracing its line across the console. She was staring at the frozen final frame, the woman's face caught mid-sentence, and something in her expression had gone somewhere I didn't have access to. "My mother trained as a xenobotanist," she said finally, not looking away from the screen. "Before I was born. She used to talk about a posting she almost took, early in her career, on a joint survey team studying a promising new colony world. She never said the name. She said the assignment fell through before she could ship out, some administrative reshuffle, and she always seemed a little sad about it when it came up, like she'd missed something she was supposed to be part of." She finally looked away from the screen, at me, then at Osk. I never thought to ask her the year. Neither of us said anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say to that, and because I think all 3 of us were doing the same private arithmetic, wondering how many careers, how many quiet redirected postings, how many small unexplained administrative reshuffles across the Concord had been the invisible edges of the same decision, made 31 years ago by people who had decided a discovery was safer left unmade. "I'm not saying it was the same posting," Tamsin said, quieter now. "I'm saying I don't know that it wasn't, and I don't like how easy it would have been for me to never think to ask." The 3 of us sat in the crew room for a long time after the footage ended, and it was Osk, finally, who said the thing none of us wanted to be the one to say first. "We didn't quarantine a dead world," he said. "We quarantined a living one, because it was doing something none of us knew how to file a report about, and it was easier to close the file than to answer the question." I thought about the wave of light moving through the canopy beneath our drone, tracking its flight with a precision that meant something down there had been paying attention the entire time. I thought about a message folded into our own recorded footage and handed back to us, patient, deliberate, the way you place something carefully into an open hand. 31 years of silence, and we had spent every one of those years telling ourselves it meant the matter was finished. It had never been finished. It had simply been waiting for someone to look at it closely enough to ask what it actually was. The ship arrived on the 4th day, and it did not arrive the way I expected anything from Verdance to arrive, which is to say it did not arrive with any drama at all. Our long-range array caught it 18 minutes before it reached the outpost's perimeter, a single small vessel, unregistered, rising out of Verdance's thin atmosphere on a burn so smooth and so precisely calculated that Tamsin, watching the trajectory plot, said quietly that whoever was flying it had done this exact approach before, more than once, probably many times, in a simulator or in fact she couldn't say which. It hailed us before we hailed it. "Outpost called a reach," said a voice, human, unhurried, carrying none of the tension I would have expected from someone flying out of a world that had been sealed off from the rest of the galaxy for 3 decades. "This is the transport Amaranth, requesting permission to dock. We are not carrying weapons. We are not carrying a warning. We would like to talk." Osk looked at me, and I understood the look, because I was thinking the same thing. There was a version of this moment where the correct, procedurally sound response was to refuse contact, escalate immediately to Concord Central, and let people with far more authority than a border outpost decide what happened next. That was, in fact, exactly what our training told us to do. "Permission granted," Osk said instead, and I watched something settle in his shoulders as he said it, the particular relief of a man choosing to be curious instead of careful, after 3 decades of an institution telling him there was nothing left on Verdance worth being curious about. The Amaranth docked without incident, and 3 figures came through the airlock, and it was the third one that made Tamsin go very still beside me, because the third one was not, strictly speaking, only human. The 2 in front introduced themselves plainly. A woman, dark-eyed, steady, who gave her name as Naomi Okafor Reyes and said she spoke for what she called the Verdance Compact. A younger man beside her, quieter, watchful, named Tio Alvarez, who carried a small case against his chest with both arms the way you carry something you have been asked, very seriously, not to drop. The third figure did not give a name at first. They stood a half-step behind the other 2, tall, human in shape and bearing, but their skin along both forearms held a faint branching pattern beneath the surface, pale green gold, that pulsed, very slowly, in a rhythm I recognized instantly, because I had spent 4 days staring at exactly that rhythm on a monitoring screen. "This is Kest," Naomi said finally, gesturing to the figure beside her, her voice careful in the way people are careful when they know a piece of information is going to be difficult to receive well. Kest speaks for Verdance itself, not as a representative in the way TEO and I represent the Compact. Kest is, in the fullest sense either of our languages currently have, part of the conversation the planet is having with us right now, in real time, through the same channel that's carrying our voices to you. I did not know how to respond to that, and I don't think Osk did either, because neither of us said anything for a long moment, and into that silence, Kest spoke, and their voice was quiet, and layered, and carried, underneath the words, the faintest trace of that same 6-minute pulse rendered almost inaudibly as tone. "You sent something down to look at us," Kest said. "We sent something back. We are glad you understood it was meant as an answer, not a warning." "What was the message?" I asked, before I could think better of asking a stranger's question of something that was, apparently, not entirely a stranger, and not entirely a single person either. Kest looked at me for a long moment, and something in that look was unmistakably kind. "We told you we remembered how to be found," they said. "We've been ready to be found for a long time. We were waiting until we were sure it would go well for the people who came looking, and not just for us." Naomi stepped forward then, her posture shifting into something more formal, and I understood we had reached the part of this visit that had brought them here in the first place. "I need to tell you something you're not going to want to hear," she said, looking directly at Osk. "And I need to tell you quickly, because we don't have as much time as any of us would like." "Tell me," Osk said. 31 years ago, when the survey team here recorded findings that this world's biosphere had developed something functionally close to a distributed intelligence, and that the human colonists here had formed a genuine mutual relationship with it rather than simply settling on top of it, that finding went up your chain of command exactly once, before it was buried. Naomi's voice stayed level, but there was an old grief moving underneath it. The Concord's Threat Assessment Board didn't see a discovery. They saw an uncontrolled variable wearing the shape of an entire ecosystem, tied to a human population they already didn't fully trust. They classified it, under emergency authority, as a contamination risk requiring containment. "That's why the quarantine," Osk said quietly. "That's why the quarantine," Naomi agreed. "What none of you were told, because it was buried in the same sealed order, is that containment protocol for a confirmed biological contamination event carries an automatic escalation clause. If containment is ever compromised, if the quarantine boundary is ever breached from either direction, The standing order authorizes immediate sterilization of the affected site, no further review required. She let that sit in the room for a moment. Your drone breached the boundary 4 days ago. Standard Concord monitoring protocol requires that breach to be reported up the chain within 72 hours. I felt something cold move through my chest, because I already knew, before she finished the thought, exactly what report Director Osk had filed, in careful, procedurally correct language, the previous afternoon. I filed the survey findings yesterday, Osk said, and his voice had gone very quiet. Flagged as a significant anomaly requiring further investigation. I didn't know there was an automatic escalation clause. Nobody told me that clause existed. Nobody was supposed to remember it existed, Naomi said. It's been 31 years. But bureaucracies don't forget the way people do. They just stop mentioning things until the file gets opened again. She looked toward the observation port, toward the pale curve of Verdance turning below us, green and glowing and, for the first time in 3 decades, visible to people who had the authority to act on what they saw. Your report is what opened it. The strike order came through 11 hours later, and by the time it did, all of us already knew, on some level, that it was coming, the way you know a storm is coming from the particular stillness in the air before it arrives. It reached us as a formal Concord central directive, routed through standard command channels, carrying none of the urgency its contents actually deserved, because the officers who drafted it in some administrative office 30 light years away had no idea they were signing off on the destruction of a mind. To them, according to the language of the order itself, this was routine enforcement of a standing containment protocol, triggered automatically by a confirmed boundary breach, executed by a rapid response fleet already stationed 2 days burn from our position for exactly this contingency. 2 days, the order said. A sterilization fleet, 7 vessels, already moving, already committed, arriving at Verdance in just under 48 hours to complete what 31 years of silence had left unfinished. Osk read the order twice and then set it down very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid of breaking further by handling it roughly. I can request a review, he said, mostly to himself. I can flag it for reconsideration. Central listens to reconsideration requests from post commanders, sometimes. How long does a reconsideration request take to process? Naomi asked, and her voice was gentle, because I think she already knew the answer, and I think she was giving him the chance to say it out loud rather than making him hear it from her. Osk didn't answer. He didn't need to. We all understood that the ordinary machinery of Concord bureaucracy, the machinery that had taken 11 minutes to reach a shared and unremarkable conclusion about a light on a monitoring screen, moved nothing like fast enough to outrun a fleet that had already left dock. Then we don't go through the ordinary machinery, Naomi said. We go around it. We have 48 hours to give the Concord a reason strong enough to override its own standing order, and the only reason strong enough is going to be proof. Not a report. Not a recommendation from a border post. Proof that what's down there is a mind, delivered directly to whoever is in command of that fleet, in a form clear enough that following the sterilization order would mean knowingly committing an act no Concord officer could later claim ignorance of. How do you prove a mind to people who spent 31 years deciding not to look at it? I asked. It was Kest who answered, and when they spoke, the pale branching pattern beneath their skin brightened, very slightly, in a way that made the hair along my arms rise. You let them feel it, Kest said. Not a recording. Not a report. A direct, willing, entirely undefended communication, offered to every ship in that fleet at once, showing them exactly what we are and exactly what will die if they carry out that order. It has never been done at this scale before. It will mean opening every mind on every one of those 7 ships to something none of them have ever experienced, without any of the protective distance a screen or a report normally provides. Kest paused. It will also mean that for the length of that communication, Verdance, and every person bonded to it, myself included, will be completely, deliberately undefended. If any commander in that fleet chooses in that moment to fire rather than listen, there will be nothing standing between that choice and its result. We would be showing them our whole self with no shield raised at all. The room went very quiet. That's not a demonstration, Tamsin said slowly. That's surrender, dressed up as a demonstration. It's trust, Kess said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of settled, patient calm that I found, in that moment, almost unbearable to be near. We have had 31 years to build weapons instead. Some worlds, in our position, would have. We chose to build this instead, a way to be known completely, because we believe that if we were ever found again, the people who found us would rather understand us than destroy us, if only they were given a true enough chance to choose. And if you're wrong? Osk asked quietly. Then we will have been wrong in the last way that mattered, Kes said, having tried, honestly, to be understood, rather than having spent our last hours hiding from people who were only ever afraid of us because no one had ever let them see us clearly. I looked at Naomi, and at TEO, standing quietly beside her with that small case still held against his chest, and I understood, finally, what was inside it. Not a weapon. A relay, small enough to carry by hand, built to carry exactly the kind of signal Kest was describing across the distance to an approaching fleet, if someone was willing to activate it and stand beside it while it worked. We need your outpost's long-range array, Naomi said, looking at Osk. Ours isn't powerful enough to reach that fleet before it's close enough to fire regardless. Yours is. We are asking you to let us use Concord hardware, on a Concord border post, to override a Concord kill order. We are asking you to choose a side before either of us fully understands what siding with us might cost you. Before you decide, Naomi said, I want to be honest about one more thing, because you're a Concord officer and you deserve to make this choice with the same clarity we are asking that fleet to extend to us. If you let us use your array, and if this works, you will have knowingly assisted a foreign biological entity in overriding a lawful Concord sterilization order. There is no version of what happens next where that decision doesn't follow you. Central will want to know why a border post commander chose to trust an unverified transmission from an unregistered vessel over a direct chain of command directive. I can't promise you that choosing correctly will protect you from the consequences of having made it. I'm aware, Osk said. I don't think you fully are, Naomi said, not unkindly. I've watched institutions punish people for being right at the wrong moment more times than I've watched them reward it. I'd rather you go into this with your eyes open than have you discover afterward that I let you believe it would be simple. Osk was quiet for a moment, looking at the pale glowing pattern beneath Kest's skin, at Tamsin standing very still beside her console, at me, waiting for whatever he decided next the way I had waited, 11 years, for a posting that finally asked something of me. I spent 6 years here filing reports about nothing, he said finally. I used to tell myself that was the job. Watch, confirm, don't speculate. Let people with more authority decide what any of it means. I believed that for a long time because believing it was easier than admitting how much I'd started to resent it. He looked back at Naomi. For days ago I found out that the last time someone in my position had the chance to ask a real question about this world, they closed the file instead, and 31 years of silence happened because of it. I'm not going to make that same choice twice just because it might be safer for my record. Director Osk had run Calder Reach for 6 years, had spent a career filing correct reports and following correct procedures, and had, for days earlier, been a man whose greatest professional ambition was an unremarkable, uneventful final tour before retirement. He looked at the 7 of us in that small crew room, at a planet turning green and patient below, at 48 hours standing between an old fear and whatever might come after it. Use the array, he said. The fleet arrived on schedule, exactly as the sterilization order had promised, 7 vessels dropping out of transit in tight formation at the edge of Verdance gravity well, their weapons arrays already active, already tracking, already precisely calibrated for the specific orbital sweep pattern that a total surface sterilization required. From our monitoring deck, watching them resolve on our screens, they looked less like ships and more like a verdict that had already been reached, arriving now only to be carried out. Naomi stood beside our long-range array console with TEO's relay device wired directly into our transmission systems, and Kes stood beside her, very still, the pale pattern beneath their skin glowing now with a steady, unbroken brightness that hadn't been there an hour before. Once we begin, Naomi said, we can't stop partway through. A communication like this either completes or it doesn't happen at all. If they fire before it finishes, it ends where it ends, and there won't be a second attempt. How long does it take to complete? Osk asked. We don't know, Kest said honestly. We've never done this at this scale, to this many minds, from this far away. Long enough that every gunnery officer on those 7 ships is going to have real, uninterrupted time to decide whether they still want to pull the trigger once they understand what they're aiming at. The fleet commander hailed us before we could hail them, her voice clipped and procedural, entirely unaware of what was about to be offered to her. Outpost Calder Reach. This is Strike Command Il-Savord. You are inside a declared containment perimeter with unauthorized vessels present. Clear the area immediately. Sterilization sequence begins in 40 minutes. Osk opened the channel. Commander Vord, this is Director Osk, called a reach. Before you begin that sequence, I am requesting, under post commander discretion, that you accept an incoming transmission. I have reviewed evidence suggesting the sterilization target does not meet the legal definition of a contamination site. I believe it meets the definition of an inhabited, sentient world. There was a pause on the line, brief, professionally skeptical. Director, that determination isn't within a border post's authority to make. I'm not making the determination, Osk said. I'm asking you to receive the evidence and make it yourself, before you complete an act that will be impossible to walk back afterward. 40 minutes is enough time to listen, Commander. It is not enough time to be certain you're right without listening. Another pause, longer this time. And then, quietly, almost reluctantly, send your transmission, Director. You have until my window opens. Not a second more. Naomi looked at Kest. Kest looked, for just a moment, toward the observation port, toward the green curve of the world they had spent their whole strange, hybrid existence learning how to be part of. Then they nodded, once, and TEO activated the relay. I do not have adequate words for what the next several minutes were like to witness, even from outside it, even as someone who was never meant to receive the communication directly and only felt its edges, the way you feel the warmth of a fire from across a room rather than the fire itself. The array hummed with a frequency that made the deck plating under my feet vibrate very faintly. Kest's eyes closed. The pattern beneath their skin brightened until it was nearly painful to look at directly, and somewhere below us, across the whole visible curve of Verdance, the canopy's bioluminescence surged in a single vast synchronized pulse that Tamsin, watching our external cameras with tears standing unshed in her eyes, described afterward as looking like the entire world had taken one deep, unified breath. The 40 minutes Commander Vord had granted us did not feel like 40 minutes. They felt like something outside of ordinary time entirely, the way a held breath stretches past the length it should reasonably be able to last. I stood near the back of the monitoring deck, not close enough to be in anyone's way, and I watched the transmission readout climb and climb, a single unbroken line of data pouring out towards 7 ships that had arrived, less than an hour earlier, fully intending to erase everything that line represented. Tamsin stood beside me, her hand pressed flat against the edge of the console, and I understood without asking that she was thinking about her mother, about a posting that fell through 31 years ago for reasons nobody had ever bothered to explain, about how close this world had come to being erased twice by people who had simply never been given the chance to look at it properly the first time. On the comm channel, we could hear fragments of what was happening aboard the fleet. Not words. Sounds. A gunnery officer's sharp indrawn breath. Someone, somewhere on one of those 7 ships, saying a name, quietly, the name of someone they loved, apparently entirely without meaning to say it aloud. Commander Vord's voice, when it finally came back onto the open channel, had lost every trace of its earlier clipped procedure. Stand down, she said, and her voice was not quite steady. All vessels, stand down targeting arrays. Weapons to safe. Nobody fires. Nobody fires until I say otherwise, and I am not going to say otherwise. Kest's eyes opened. The glow beneath their skin dimmed, slowly, back toward its resting rhythm, and they swayed, just slightly, and Naomi caught their arm without seeming to think about it, an old, practiced gesture between people who had done this, in some smaller form, many times before. It's done, Kest said quietly, and there was exhaustion in the words, real and physical, but underneath the exhaustion there was something else too, something I only recognized because I had spent 4 days watching a light I didn't understand slowly become a world I did. Relief. Not the relief of danger passing. The relief of finally, after 31 years, being seen clearly by someone with the power to choose differently, and having that someone choose to. Commander Vord's voice came through again, quieter now, almost unwilling, the voice of someone whose whole professional life had just been rearranged by something she had not been trained to file a report about. Director Osk, she said, I need you to tell me exactly what I just received, because I am not able to complete the sterilization order I was given, and I am going to need a very good explanation for Central as to why. I think, Osk said slowly, looking out at Verdance, green and glowing and, for the first time in 31 years, undeniably, unmistakably present. That's a conversation all of us are going to need to have. The days that followed were not simple, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories about moments like this one too often skip the part where everything remains difficult even after the worst outcome has been avoided. Commander Vord's fleet did not leave. They held position, weapons safed, while a flood of priority communications moved back and forth between her flagship, our outpost, and Concord Central, each side trying to determine what, precisely, had just happened and what it obligated anyone to do next. Concord Central did not immediately apologize, and did not immediately grant Verdance any formal recognition, and did not immediately rescind the 31-year-old containment order in the sweeping, clean way I privately hoped they would. Bureaucracies, I have come to understand, do not turn quickly even when they have been shown, undeniably, that they were wrong. What Central did do, within 6 days, was suspend the sterilization protocol pending formal review, which was not justice, but was, for the first time in 31 years, a door left open rather than sealed. Naomi stayed at Calder Reach through most of those 6 days, along with TEO, while Kest returned to the surface to rest, worn thin in a way I didn't fully understand but could see plainly in how carefully Naomi spoke about them afterward. I spent a great deal of that time talking with Naomi in the outpost's small crew room, and I asked her, on the last evening before she returned to the surface herself, the question I had been carrying since the moment Kest first spoke. Why didn't you come back sooner? I asked. If you'd built something capable of proving what Verdance is, why wait 31 years to use it? She considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because the first time we tried something close to this, decades ago, it went badly, she said. Not the sterilization order, that came after. Before that, in the earliest days, a few of us tried to explain what was happening here to Concord representatives directly, in words, in reports, the ordinary way. We were dismissed. Not cruelly. Just quietly, the way people dismiss something they've already decided can't be true. We learned that telling wasn't going to be enough. We needed a different way to be known, one that didn't depend on anyone being willing to believe a report first. She looked toward the observation port, toward the world below. Building that took time. Building trust with Verdance itself, deep enough that it would be willing to show itself that completely, took even longer. 31 years wasn't hesitation. It was the actual length of time it took to become something worth being believed. I thought about that for a long time afterward, about the difference between being quiet because you have nothing to say and being quiet because you are still becoming the thing you will eventually need to show someone. I thought about Director Osk, standing in front of Commander Vord's fleet with nothing but a report and a request, choosing to trust something he did not yet understand because the alternative was letting an old fear finish what it had started 3 decades earlier without anyone ever being asked to look at it clearly first. On my last shift before the formal Concord review delegation arrived to begin what would become, over the following 2 years, a complete renegotiation of Verdance status, I sat alone on the monitoring deck and pulled up the same screen that had woken me 11 days earlier with a single unexplained pulse of green light. The basin was still glowing, steady now, unhurried, no longer signaling anything urgent because there was, for the moment, nothing urgent left to say. I thought about how close we had come to sterilizing a mind because a report had been filed and forgotten instead of finished, because it had been easier, 31 years ago, to close a file than to sit with an uncomfortable question. I thought about how the difference between disaster and discovery, in the end, had come down to whether anyone was willing to keep watching closely enough, for long enough, to notice when a silence stopped meaning nothing and started meaning something had been growing the whole time. Commander Vord stayed in the sector for the full 6 days of the review's opening phase, and on the last of them, before her fleet was finally released back to standard patrol duty, she asked to speak with me privately, which surprised me enough that I nearly declined out of simple nerves. She was not what I expected. She had the tired, careful bearing of someone who had spent a great deal of time in the preceding days rewriting, in her own mind, a version of events she had believed completely only a week earlier. I want to ask you something and I want an honest answer, she said, standing at the same observation port where the fleet's weapons had gone dark. If Director Osk hadn't requested that window, if I'd followed the order exactly as written, I would have executed it without ever knowing what I was executing. That's not a hypothetical I find easy to sit with. I don't think any of us find it easy, I said. I've served the Concord for 26 years, she said. I believed, genuinely, that the orders I was given had already been through the kind of scrutiny that made questioning them unnecessary. I'm having to relearn, at my age, that scrutiny and time are not the same thing, and that an order can be 31 years old and still have never actually been examined by anyone. She looked at me for a long moment. You're young. Don't let this be the only time in your career you ask the question before it's asked of you. I have carried that conversation with me since, more than almost anything Naomi or Kest said to me during those difficult days, because it came from someone whose whole professional life had been built on the assumption that the system above her had already done the asking, and who had just discovered, in the space of 40 minutes, how much had been resting on that assumption never being tested. I still work at Calder Reach, though it is not the posting it once was. The outpost has a new designation now, one that took the formal review board the better part of a year to agree on: Joint Observation and Liaison Station, Verdance. We are no longer watching a quarantine boundary. We are hosting, on a rotating basis, biologists and diplomats and ordinary curious visitors from a dozen Concord worlds who have finally been permitted to see what Naomi Okafor Reyes and a handful of others spent 3 decades quietly building in a basin the rest of the galaxy had been told to stop looking at. Kest visits the outpost occasionally, when the work requires it, and each time I am struck again by how ordinary they seem in conversation and how extraordinary the fact of them remains underneath that ordinariness, a living bridge between two kinds of mind that had, for 31 years, been kept carefully, officially, unnecessarily apart. I asked them once, on one of those visits, standing at the same observation port where Director Osk had once watched a fleet's weapons arrays go dark, what they remembered most clearly about the day the strike fleet arrived. The waiting, Kest said, after a moment. Not the transmission itself. The 40 minutes before it, standing beside your array, not knowing whether we'd built something worth being seen for, or whether 31 years of care had simply produced a very patient way to be destroyed. They looked out at the green curve of the world below, steady now, unhurried, no longer needing to prove anything to anyone. I think that's the part people misunderstand about patience, when they hear stories like this one afterward. It isn't calm because nothing is at stake. It's calm because you've already decided what you're willing to risk in order to finally be understood, and there's nothing left to do, once that decision is made, except wait to find out if it was enough. I think about that conversation often, usually late in a shift, when the monitoring deck is quiet and the basin below is glowing its slow, steady rhythm into the dark the way it has every night since the sterilization order was suspended. I think about how close an entire world came to being erased by people who were never given a true enough chance to see it clearly, and how the only thing that stood between that outcome and this one was a handful of people, on both sides of an old, badly drawn line, willing to keep watching a little longer than they were told they needed to. The light on my screen still wakes me sometimes, out of habit more than necessity now, a faint reflex left over from a night 11 years of quiet ended in 6 minutes. I get up. I check the reading. And every time, it is exactly what it has been since that first night, a world, patient and alive and finally, fully seen, still speaking steadily into the dark, no longer waiting for anyone to notice, simply glad, at last, that someone finally did.